As mentioned, my name is Sean. I work at the University of Edinburgh, and my main role is to look at what we call sustainable business as well as fair trade, a suite of programs around that. I'm here today to talk to you about some of the actions that we've taken at Edinburgh to incorporate human rights into our work. Obviously, what we'll find is it only really scratches the surface of some of the stuff that we've done. And when we're looking at policies that include human rights, we've already talked or heard earlier about modern slavery statement, and I'll talk about that briefly. But some of the work that's come from that is really important. What I'd like to say, though, is and this was touched upon by Boris as well, is don't forget about the other policies that come into effect around human rights. Actually, any policy that you implement, whether directly or indirectly, should be take into account human rights. So I'll talk very briefly, possibly if there's time, about the good food work that we do, the travel work, and the palm oil policy as well. I'll start though by just saying some of the points I would bring across really when you're looking at implementing good practice across the board. And this isn't really about just human rights, but across the board, about any sustainability implementation, is to get the right people in the room. Don't work in a silo. So if you're sustainability experts, or if you're procurement experts, or if you're academics, whatever parts of the university you're working in, or if you're students as well, is make sure the right people are in the room talking to each other, because that's how you make sure that whatever policy or actions that you implement will be brought in and work really well. And that's where I said some of the internal stakeholders that we engage with frequently are finance and procurement. Obviously, supply chains means that we're purchasing, our catering teams with our hospitality, for example, or our accommodation, also really important. Our estates teams in our construction work, really important there. Students Association, it's really interesting how engaged students are in human rights issues, both internally at the university and in our supply chains as well. And then obviously ourselves at the Social Responsibility and Sustainability Department, SRS is our abbreviation. You might hear me say that a few times today. There's also the external stakeholders, so framework managers. Olga mentioned LUPC, the London-based consortium. We have APUC up in Scotland, who manage frameworks and tenders within the Scottish region. We also have suppliers, really key to engage with those locally and nationally. And industry partners and partner institutions as well, others that you might develop research collaborations with, or purchasing collaborations with, whatever that might look like. Having dedicated staff and resources available to this topic is very important, as with anything. If you don't have that staff resource to really push that agenda and work on that specifically, then it can fall behind, even if there's policies in place to push that forward. So that's where my role really comes into this, is that my role is dedicated on embedding not just human rights, but sustainability across the board within our supply chains. And it really helps to be able to align any policies or actions that you take with broader organisational strategies. So at the University of Edinburgh, we have our recently released Strategy 2030, which is on, you'll see the four main strands on the right-hand side there. One of those is social and civic responsibility. If you don't have a strategy specifically that notes similar aspects, then you've got the SDGs to fall back on as well. When we look more detailed at our Strategy 2030 and that strand, social and civic responsibility, we have a delivery plan now that sort of aligns with our Strategy 2030. And I just wanted to highlight that one of the phrases within this delivery plan is it focuses on the promotion, protection, and respect for human rights. And we link that back to the SDGs there as well, to make it really clear for both senior leadership when they're signing off on these plans, but also staff and students and the general public who interact with us, that this is how it works, because things like the SDGs are a lot more understandable than some of the other terms and phrases and acts that we come across in our work. We've already heard about the modern slavery statement, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this page, but just to say that we as a university are obliged to complete the statement, and it is available on the website. Olga may disagree that having it on the footer of each of our websites isn't enough. However, this is where we've decided to put it, and we do get we had about 10,000 unique views of that page in the last year. I checked it up this morning to see where that's up to. So a very small percentage of overall university website footprint, no doubt, but it's not a minuscule amount of interactions nonetheless. So now I'm going to talk about sort of the meat of the presentation, if you like, probably the bit that you really want to hear about are some of the actions that we've taken around human rights. And as I said, this is really scratching the surface of what we've done. I've only got 15 minutes to talk about it. So we'll see how we go with that. So the first one, and we've already heard from Olga about Electronic Watch. The University of Edinburgh was a founding member back in 2014. We were, unsurprisingly, as a founding member, the first higher education institution to take part and to sign up as an affiliate. Since then, the whole Scottish university sector has signed up and become affiliated via that consortium I mentioned, APUC. And we're seeing obviously huge numbers of other institutions, both within the UK and abroad. And I believe KU Leuven were also an affiliate member very recently as well. So there's two sides of Electronics Watch that we engage with. Both there's the tender process and incorporating the wording of their sort of commitments within our tenders, and I'll be honest, that's maybe the weaker side of what we do at the minute. It's very light touch, and it could be a lot stronger. We could enforce it a lot more within our tender process. Obviously, when we talk about electronics as well, what I should say is there's the ICT category within procurement, so our computing side, but there's also our labs procurement, where we purchase some very significant lab equipment, which will have ICT and electronic parts, and those are two huge categories of spend at the University of Edinburgh, being a very research focused institution. The second side of our Electronic Watch work is all around making ICT fair, which I know some of the work actually presented earlier links into very strongly. And this was a project where we received funding via Electronics Watch. They put a funding bid together to the EU Development, Education and Awareness Raising Call. We partnered with 10 institutions, including Caterpillar in Belgium, which again I think was linked to in the other project. And this was a research work package was put together, which ran for 3 years from November 17 to October 2020. And this within this we had a PhD student who conducted field research at a number of sites of mining and manufacturing across our supply chains linked to electronics specifically. Now, obviously, in the latter part of that, there can't be a presentation that goes by now that doesn't mention COVID. Obviously, in March 2020 to October 2020, field research was greatly reduced. So the focus moved away from the field ground research to sort of desk-based research, if you like, for that short period of time. However, what I would say is the research output from this project is really worth looking at and reading, because it's actually, unlike a lot of human rights papers and sort of they can be very difficult to understand, but this is very visual and very useful for us to pass on to staff and students to gain a better understanding of what's going on. It's written in better language maybe than we might expect from recent papers. So that was a really good output for us to get from the Make ICT Fair project, which came about because we were involved in Electronics Watch. Another aspect of what we do, and again it's been touched on, is fair trade. The University of Edinburgh is a partner with the Fair Trade Universities and Colleges Award. We took part, well, we were a fair trade university and we signed up in 2004, and we continue that accreditation as a fair trade university. But in 2018, we were approached to pilot an award, which is based on a set of criteria along those 5 categories you see there. It was sort of, they brought it about based on their schools, work with schools, awards in schools, and they've sort of adapted it for universities and colleges. So we took part in, as I said, 2018. We received a 2-star award then, and we have been working towards reaccreditation, which was postponed from last year. So we resubmitted in March this year, and we've just had the audit about a week and a half ago, and we're just waiting to hear back from the results from that, which we should get in the next couple of weeks, I hope. But yeah, the actions there really focus on bringing together different parts of the university, so our procurement, our gift shop, our catering teams, students association, to build in these different criteria and work on those internally at the university, but also working with partners externally as well, so the City of Edinburgh Council and groups around that, because the City of Edinburgh is a fair trade city, and the university plays a big part in the re-accreditation of that, in supporting that as a primary employer within the region. One of the other aspects of our work I'd like to touch on is the anti-slavery policy. So as I mentioned, we have a modern slavery statement, and within that we set out actions each year, or what we're going to achieve in the following year. And in 2019-20, we developed the action that we would create an anti-slavery policy. This was developed with the modern slavery working group that we have set up, which is made up of professional staff, so that would be myself or sustainability experts, it'd be finance, it would be our HR, it would be our legal teams, as well as our academics from across the university who have expertise in human rights issues from their research. And within this anti-slavery policy, what it really does is it helps staff and students understand what the modern slavery statement means for them and what actions they need to be taking. And that, again, it whittles down quite a big, potentially complex document that we have to fulfill as part of the Modern Slavery Act to something that is a lot more straightforward for those staff and students to understand. It also does include a human right compliant grievance mechanism. So it's a way of staff, students, partners, as well as the general public to raise issues of concern that they might see in their day-to-day workings with the university and interactions with the university. And in all honesty, it's not a complicated mechanism. What all it is a form that you see on the right-hand side there, and it asks for a small amount of detail. But what's really important about this is where that form actually goes to. It goes to the Director of Procurement for them to follow up directly. So it shows that we are, as an institution, putting a level of importance on this mechanism, that we understand that human rights within our supply chain is likely, in all honesty, there are risks involved in a lot of the procurement and the work that we do, and that there is an easy way for everybody to process that to a senior level. The last point, sort of actions that I'd like to talk about, is the research that we do. And I've already talked about Make ICT Fair, but the university as a whole has a living lab ethos. So we like to use the data that we produce, because we obviously internally produce a lot of data on our operational side, and we use that to support students with projects related to interesting topics or to topics that interest them. And these projects are developed by SRS ourselves or interested academics, and they're then promoted to students directly through a dedicated portal. And if those projects are taken up by students, then they are supported by SRS ourselves or academics. And these could be group projects, or they could be dissertation level projects as well, depending on what scale project we're looking at. And just to say that we've had a number of projects around modern slavery, around sort of human rights. So whether it be fair phone use of fair phone, conflict minerals, as well as sort of looking at our garment supply chain and the modern slavery and human rights issues potentially within those specific supply chains. And as I mentioned before, there's also numerous researchers who work on human rights within their work. And they feed in, generally speaking, through the Modern Slavery Working Group. In terms of some of the challenges that we've come across, no surprises, the university is highly complex in the way it's structured. We have 15,000 plus staff and 45 or so thousand students. And that just means there's huge numbers of ways that the university can buy things. So individually, there's potentially 15,000 purchasers. Although we are limiting how people can purchase, there are always, you could potentially go to an individual supplier and purchase directly. There's also many policies to be aware of, not just related to human rights directly. And I touched on some of those earlier. So it's just making sure that staff are aware of the right policies and adhere to those, and having the mechanisms in place to monitor those as well. And that's maybe something that we fall back on by having so many policies. Those mechanisms for monitoring it are more challenging. And then we've had very recently a lot of staff changes across the organisation. So there's big parts of the university where staffing levels are not where they need to be to conduct their everyday work, let alone for sustainability to come along and say we need to be addressing sustainability on top of everything else that you're already doing. So we need to be aware of that. I'm saying we shouldn't be pushing the agenda of human rights or sustainability more generally. But we do need to be aware that certain parts of the university have a certain bandwidth and they need to be getting on with some of their work that they basically can't do at the minute. Finding, as we've heard, data on sustainability, human rights issues within a supply chain is really difficult. The longer, more complex the supply chain becomes, the reduced the transparency becomes within this. So as soon as you get, well, even past tier 1, let's be honest, as soon as you get down the tiers, it becomes really difficult to establish if there's any violations going on and to make those changes required and to monitor it. And that's not saying that we shouldn't do it, but it's this case of establishing the best routes to make sure that that does take place when these supply chains are, certainly over the last couple of years, really stretched. And we're maybe having to be a bit more agile with where we're getting some of our equipment from and our purchasing from, to make sure that we are able to work efficiently. In terms of next steps for us here at Edinburgh, we are looking at how we can embed sustainability within our tenders and through our supply chains more broadly, which will include human rights, but will also include our carbon emissions and other aspects of sustainability. So we're looking at potentially using platforms like Ecometrica, and I know we can have a debate about whether using corporate companies such as Ecometrica is a good way of doing it. There are pluses and minuses for sure on those, but it's just how we develop that pathway and how that works with procurement and other key stakeholders. We are looking to evaluate our existing human rights related policies. I put an asterisk on one of the first slides. Our conflict mineral policy is actually due for update, and our palm oil policy is just coming up to renewal as well. So looking at those and how we maybe integrate some of those to streamline some of those a bit more sufficiently. Also ensuring that human rights continues to be included in indirect policies through things like equality impact assessments, and so on and so forth, making sure that all policies that we have relate to human rights when supply chains are talked about. We do need to update our modern slavery statement. That's an annual occurrence, and we will need to conform to the new modern slavery bill, which was announced in the Queen's speech a few weeks ago. Personally, I don't know what that means just yet. Maybe Olga will have a better idea of what that bill will entail, but we just assume it will involve more rigorous information being shown and passed on. And then we need to continue raising awareness within our supply chains and across our staff and students. As I mentioned, there's been a number of staff changes at Edinburgh, and I'm sure it'll be the same elsewhere as well, that we need to rebuild those relationships, that we run the risk of becoming, again, siloed within our own location, and we don't have those connections and we don't hear about those and work towards those together. That is the end of my presentation. A very whistle-stop tour, so I will stop there, but I believe Olga's going to present next, and then there's time for questions at the end. So if you do have them, feel free to pop them in the chat or wait till the end and we'll get to them then. But thank you very much.